Some stories don't break you all at once. Some of them take their time. They unfold quietly like dusk turning into night, soft, slow, and unavoidable. I used to believe the hardest thing that would ever happen to me was the stroke. The moment my right side fell silent, my arm refusing to lift, my leg forgetting how to take a step, my mouth struggling to shape the words my heart was screaming. But I was wrong. Losing my strength hurt me. Losing my family hurt both sides of my heart. I remember the morning it happened. The sun was just rising, spreading a pale, gentle light across my kitchen table. I had poured myself a cup of coffee the way I always did, 2 sugars, 1 cream, a habit I picked up when my wife was still alive. She used to tease me about it, said I was sweet enough without the extra sugar. I can still hear her laughter sometimes, like it echoes from a room I can't open anymore. That morning my cup slipped from my hand. Not a dramatic crash, not a cinematic collapse, just a soft, confused clatter. My fingers wouldn't hold it. My arm wouldn't lift. And when I tried to call out for help, the words tangled themselves somewhere between my brain and my lips. I don't remember falling, but I remember the floor, cold, unforgiving, and far too quiet. They say a stroke is like a thief. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't warn you. Just takes. By the time I reached the hospital, half of me felt like it belonged to someone else. Heavy, distant, like dragging a ghost through every hallway, every scan, every whispered conversation between doctors who thought I couldn't hear. But I heard everything. And I felt everything, fear first, then anger, then a strange, hollow acceptance. What I didn't feel was the presence of the people I had spent my life loving. My son lived 20 minutes away. My daughter about 40. My grandchildren, well, I had their pictures on my fridge. Little magnets holding memories in place. I kept waiting for the door to open, for someone to rush in with tears or worry or even pretend concern. But the only people who came were nurses, gentle souls with tired eyes and warm hands who called me, sir, even when I wished they'd call me dad. The first night was the longest one of my life. You'd think the paralysis would be the thing that broke me, the frustration of not moving, not speaking clearly, not being able to press the call button with a hand that no longer obeyed me. But no. What broke me was the sound of the hallway. Footsteps for other rooms. Voices for other patients. Families visiting other people. I lay there, staring at the ceiling that had nothing to say, and I kept thinking, surely they'll come tomorrow. Maybe they're busy. Maybe they didn't get the message right away. I convinced myself of 100 reasons. 1,000 excuses. Hope can be a stubborn thing, especially when you've spent your whole life giving your heart to people who never learned how to hold it. On the 3rd day, a nurse asked me, has anyone been by to see you? I wanted to lie. I wanted to protect the family I raised, the children I worked myself to the bone for, the people I gave my youth, my health, my best years to. But all I managed to say was, not yet. The nurse placed her hand on my shoulder. A small gesture. But in that moment, it felt like the first human warmth I'd received in days. She said softly, you deserve better. And I realized something I never wanted to admit. I agreed with her. I know I wasn't a perfect father. I made my mistakes. Too much work, too little time, too many days when exhaustion stole my patience. But I loved them. God, I loved them. I thought that counted for something. I thought loving someone your whole life meant they would show up when you needed them, just once. The physical therapy began a week later. Relearning how to move my own body felt strangely like parenting again, patient, repetitive, exhausting. But there was a difference. I showed up for myself, even when my own children didn't show up for me. Every morning they would pull me to my feet, guide my right leg forward, ask me to grip their fingers with a hand that trembled like an autumn leaf. Some days I made progress. Some days I cried. Some days I pretended I was fine. But the hardest days were the lonely ones. There were no balloons. No cards. No laughter filling the room. No familiar voices saying, hey Dad, you're gonna get through this. There was just me. And the slow, steady sound of my own breathing, reminding me that half my body might have given up on me, but the other half was still fighting. Nurses would ask, any updates from your family? I would smile, a crooked smile the stroke had carved into me, and say, maybe tomorrow. But tomorrow came and tomorrow left, and the visitor chair in my room remained empty, a quiet, accusing witness to all the love I had given, and all the love I didn't receive in return. I remember one night, it must have been around 2 a.m., when the world outside was so silent it felt like even the moon was asleep. I turned my head slowly, painfully toward that empty chair, and I whispered as best as I could, why wasn't I worth the drive? My voice cracked. My heart cracked with it. And for the first time since the stroke, I wished the other half of me had gone silent too, just so I wouldn't have to feel the ache of abandonment. Physical paralysis is heavy. But emotional abandonment, that's a weight you feel on both sides of your chest. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see that chair, simple, plastic, blue, waiting for someone who was never coming. And I think that was the moment I realized something. I wasn't grieving the stroke. I was grieving the love I thought I had. I was grieving the family I believed would be there. The family I had pictured in my mind, not the one whose absence echoed more loudly than my weakened heartbeat. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into a strange, lonely routine. Therapy, meals, silence, sleep, repeat. But slowly, so slowly I barely noticed, something inside me began to shift. Not my muscles, not my speech, not my balance. Something deeper. Something quieter. Like a small lantern finally flickering to life inside a long-abandoned room. A strength I didn't know I still had. A strength that whispered, if they won't hold your hand, learn to hold your own. That's where the rest of my story begins. I didn't grow stronger all at once. No, it came in tiny, almost invisible ways, the kind of changes you only notice when you stop to breathe. It began with a single step. My left foot steady, my right foot trembling beneath the weight of a body that felt unfamiliar. The therapist stood beside me, guiding, encouraging, patient. But the truth is, I wasn't walking toward recovery that day. I was walking away from the idea that someone was coming to save me. We say we accept disappointment, but sometimes the heart accepts it long before the mind does. My mind kept imagining my son's face in the doorway, my daughter carrying flowers, my grandkids running in with drawings to tape on the wall. But my heart, my worn, wiser, quieter heart, had already closed the door on that hope. Still, every time I heard footsteps in the hallway, I turned my head, slowly, painfully, just in case. There's a different kind of hurt that comes from hoping against your own better judgment. One afternoon, a volunteer came by. She asked if she could read to me. Her voice was soft, her hands thin and trembling like mine, and she reminded me a little of my wife in her later years. She read a poem about growing old, about how time doesn't just take from us, it teaches us what we were too busy to learn when we were young. And as she read, I felt something warm rising in my chest, a painful warmth, grief softened by understanding. When she finished, she smiled and said, "Do you have someone to read to you at home?" I didn't know how to answer. Not in a way that wouldn't embarrass me. Not in a way that wouldn't embarrass the memories of my family. So I simply said, "Not anymore." She nodded as if she understood without needing the details. Then she squeezed my left hand gently, the only one that still listened to me, and left the room in a silence so gentle, it didn't feel as heavy as the ones before. After she left, a nurse came in with my dinner tray. She set it down, smiled kindly, and then paused for a moment longer than usual. She glanced at the untouched cards sitting on my bedside table, hospital greeting cards, not family ones, and she said quietly, "Some people don't show up until it's too late. Don't let that be your story on both sides." I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time. But her words stayed with me. That night, I practiced my speech again. Slow, slurred words, forced into place like puzzle pieces from different boxes. "I am still here." I said it over and over until the words came out clearer. Until they sounded true. I wasn't saying it for the hospital staff. I wasn't saying it for my absent family. I was saying it for me. For the part of me that still believed my worth was measured by who showed up. But life, especially in our later years, has a way of revealing truths we spent decades avoiding. One afternoon, a hospital social worker visited. She sat beside my bed with a clipboard in her hands, but her eyes were soft, far softer than the questions she had to ask. She asked about my home. About who lived with me. Who checked on me. Who helped me with groceries, appointments, anything at all. I gave short answers. She didn't need to hear the long, painful ones. When she asked, "Do you have dependable family support?" my throat closed. My mouth tried to form the word yes, but it got stuck somewhere behind my ribs. Instead, I felt my eyes sting, a slow, embarrassing warmth, and I whispered, "No, not really." She nodded with a compassion that almost broke me because it didn't feel like pity. It felt like someone finally seeing me. "We'll make sure you're not alone," she said. Simple words. But they filled the room in a way my children's voices never did. That evening, I stared at the blank wall across from me, the one where other patients had pinned photos, letters, drawings from kids. I stared at my empty wall and realized something. A person can survive paralysis, but it's much harder to survive feeling forgotten. Days later, I was moved to the rehab wing. A new room, a new bed, and a new chair. The visitor's chair. I avoided looking at it at first. It felt too familiar. like an old wound dressed in new cloth. The therapist, a patient young woman with kind eyes, helped me stand for the first time in the new room. My right leg barely lifted. My right arm hung uselessly at my side. But I stood. And when I looked into the mirror, I barely recognized the man staring back at me. Half of my face drooped. Half of my body sagged. But both of my eyes were crying. I don't know why that moment broke me more than the stroke itself. Maybe because it was the first time I saw myself honestly. Not as a father or a provider or a protector, but as an aging man with a tired heart and a body that had finally matched the sadness it carried for years. I whispered something to the mirror that day, something I had never dared speak aloud before. I deserved better than this. I don't know if it was the stroke or the loneliness or the soft, slow wisdom that comes to those who've lost too much, but the words didn't feel bitter. They felt like the truth. A truth I had avoided for decades. After therapy, I sat by the window watching the sun begin its slow descent, a soft, orange glow settling into the world. And I thought about all the years I had worked, all the sacrifices I had made, all the times I had told myself that love meant giving everything even if nothing came back. But now I was learning something new. Sometimes the greatest heartbreak isn't losing your health. It's realizing how easily people can live without your presence, even when you spent your life making sure they never had to. As the sky darkened, I slowly lifted my good hand to my chest, feeling the steady beat beneath my skin. It was the one part of me that hadn't abandoned me. It whispered quietly in its rhythmic, stubborn way. You're still here. Whether they show up or not, you're still here. And for the first time since the stroke, those words felt like enough. The nights in rehab were different from the hospital. Quieter in some ways, lonelier in others. The hallways weren't filled with frantic footsteps or urgent voices. Instead, they held a kind of stillness, a stillness that made every thought louder, every memory sharper, every regret heavier. My room had a small lamp that cast a warm, golden circle on the floor. It looked like a tiny sun, a reminder that even in the dimmest places, light still finds a way to exist. Most nights, I watched that little circle of light and thought about my children. About how things had changed slowly, then all at once. There was a time when they used to call me just to say hello. A time when my birthday meant a cake and not just a reminder that another year had slipped by. A time when they still believed I had all the answers. But life pulls people in different directions. Jobs, marriages, obligations, and somewhere along the line, the man who once carried them on his shoulders became too heavy to carry in their schedules. Or maybe I became a mirror they didn't want to look into. A reminder of aging, of vulnerability, of the future they didn't want to imagine. I don't blame them for living their lives. But I do blame myself for expecting to still be part of those lives. One night, while staring at the lamp's circle of light, I whispered, almost to the empty room, almost to my younger self. You gave them your time. You forgot to save any for yourself. The words echoed inside me. Not angry. Not resentful. Just painfully honest. A few days later, I was assigned a new nurse, a middle-aged woman named Clara. She had a softness in her voice, like she had carried her own share of heartbreak. When she took my vitals, she didn't rush. She didn't treat me like an obligation on a chart. She treated me like a person. One afternoon, she noticed the untouched spot where family photos would usually be. No pictures? She asked gently. I shook my head. No visitors? She tried again. My eyes stung and I managed, they're busy. She didn't correct me. She didn't offer false comfort. She just placed her hand over mine, my good hand, and held it for a moment. You're not forgotten, she whispered. You're not. I didn't realize how much I needed those words until they seeped into the cracks of my heart like warm water. After she left, I stared at the empty space on my bedside table and felt something shift inside me, a kind of quiet acceptance. Not the bitter kind. Not the defeated kind. A softer acceptance, like finally understanding that some chapters end even when we're still holding on to the pages. The next morning during therapy, I surprised myself. When they helped me stand, I didn't wobble as much. My right foot lifted a little higher. My grip on the parallel bars tightened, just for a few seconds but long enough for the therapist to smile. You're getting stronger, she said. And for the first time I believed her. That afternoon I was wheeled outside. The rehab center had a small courtyard. Nothing special, just a few benches, a couple of trees and flowers planted by volunteers. But to me, it felt like stepping into a world I thought I'd lost. The breeze was soft, carrying the faint scent of pine. Birds fluttered in the branches in a way that made the silence feel alive instead of empty. I closed my eyes and breathed in deeply, A real breath, one that filled the parts of me the stroke couldn't reach. And for a brief moment I felt whole again. Not because my body was healed. Not because my family had returned. But because the world still held beauty, even if I had to see it alone. As I sat there with the sun warming my face, I thought about forgiveness. Not the kind you give to others, but the kind you learn to give yourself when you're older. I forgave myself for working too much. For missing recitals and ball games. For thinking providing was the same as parenting. For believing love guaranteed loyalty. And then, very slowly, I forgave them too. Not because they earned it. Not because they apologized. Not because they finally showed up. I forgave them because holding on to the hurt was paralyzing more parts of me than the stroke ever could. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the courtyard, I whispered to the sky, "I'm still here, and I'm learning to be enough for myself." The words didn't fix everything, but they softened the ache. They loosened the grip of old wounds. And they made room, just a little, for something like peace. That night, when I returned to my room, the visitor's chair no longer looked like a symbol of abandonment. It looked like a place I could sit someday, when I walked again, as a man who survived more than a stroke. A man who survived being forgotten. And maybe, that was the beginning of healing in both sides of my heart. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. Not a miracle, not some grand gesture, just a slow, subtle awakening inside me, like a door opening to a room I hadn't entered in years. I began to notice people again. Not the ones I was waiting for, but the ones right in front of me. There was an older man down the hall, recovering from a fall that had taken more than just his balance. His wife visited every day, holding his hand like it was the last precious thing she owned. Watching them made my chest ache, not with envy, but with a kind of longing I had forgotten how to name. There was a woman in her early 70s, learning to walk again after surgery. She had no family either, but she laughed with the staff as if the loneliness never touched her. She taught me that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums quietly beneath the pain. And there were the nurses, God bless them, carrying stories in their tired shoulders, smiling even when the day had taken more from them than it gave. I started talking to them. Not much at first, just a few words formed carefully with my healing mouth. But each word felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. One evening, the sun was melting into the horizon, painting the windows with gold and orange. Clara came in to check my vitals. She looked at me for a moment, a long, searching look, and said, "You look lighter today." Lighter. Not stronger. Not healthier. Just lighter. And she was right. I told her, slowly, that I had spent the morning watching the birds in the courtyard. How one of them, a small sparrow, kept hopping on a branch that swayed too much to hold it steady. But it tried anyway. Again and again. Clara smiled softly and said, "Sometimes we have to learn to trust branches that don't look strong." I thought about that all night. About trust. About leaning on things that might bend under us. About trying again even when the world feels unstable. For years I trusted that my family would be there. But life has a way of teaching us that love isn't always returned, and loyalty isn't always earned through blood. The next day during therapy my right hand twitched, a tiny movement barely visible. But I felt it. I felt the spark of something inside that had been sleeping for weeks. The therapist's eyes widened and she said, "That's progress." And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to look toward the door to see if someone was there to witness it. The victory was mine even if no one else claimed it. As the days passed, I found myself talking more, to staff, to patients, even to myself. Not out of desperation but out of rediscovery. One afternoon I asked the social worker for a favor. Not to call my children. Not to ask them to visit. But to help me arrange something else. "Do you think," I said slowly, "there's a volunteer who might come sit with me sometimes? Not to talk much. Just to sit." She nodded. And she understood. There are people who crave noise and people who crave company and people, like me, who crave presence. A week later, a young man began visiting. He was in college, studying something I couldn't quite say, but he had kind eyes and a voice that carried no judgment. Sometimes he read to me. Sometimes he told me about his classes. Sometimes we just sat in silence. He never asked where my children were. He never looked at the empty table beside my bed. He just showed up. And somehow that was enough. One afternoon he told me, "You remind me of my grandfather. He always said the hardest part of growing old was feeling like everyone else was racing ahead and you were stuck in place." I nodded slowly and replied, "He was right. But he forgot something important." "What's that?" he asked. "That sometimes staying in one place lets you see things the racers miss." He smiled, a warm, genuine smile, and I realized something. I was beginning to matter again, not to the people I once chased, but to the world that had waited quietly for me to notice it. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the last light of day stretch across the floor, a thought arrived quietly, like a soft visitor I didn't expect. Maybe the heart breaks twice so it can open wider the third time. My first heartbreak was the stroke. Losing my strength. Losing half of myself. My second heartbreak was my family. Losing the people I spent my life loving. But the third? The third was realizing I could still find connection, still find meaning, still find a reason to wake up with purpose, even without them. The room felt different after that. Not warmer, not brighter, just fuller. As if something inside me had expanded, gently pushing out years of quiet sorrow. And for the first time since everything changed, I felt ready. Ready to keep going. Ready to heal. Ready to stand again, not for anyone else but for the man I was becoming. When the night finally settled, I whispered into the darkness, a sentiment as fragile as it was true. I'm still here, and maybe that's enough to start over. The day I took my first real steps, not the assisted shuffles, not the hesitant training movements, but real, trembling, unsteady, determined steps, there was no applause. No family waiting with cameras. No familiar voices saying, "Look at you, Dad. You did it." No grandchildren running into my arms. Just me. Just the echo of my own breathing. Just a quiet hallway and a therapist holding her hands inches from my waist, ready to catch me if I fell. And yet, it was one of the proudest moments of my life. My right leg felt like a stubborn child, unwilling, unpredictable, but it moved. 1 inch forward. Then another. Each step a small rebellion against the fate my body had handed me. When I finally sat down, breathless and sweating, I laughed. Not a loud laugh, not a triumphant one, just a soft, disbelieving chuckle that came from deep inside. And the therapist said, "That laugh means more than any step." She was right. Because that laugh wasn't about walking. It was about returning to myself. Healing is strange at our age. We often think recovery belongs to the young, that resilience has an expiration date, that hope has a shelf life. But in that moment, with my heart pounding and my body shaking, I realized something important. There are parts of us that never grow old. Parts that still rise, still reach, still believe. The next few days moved slowly. My improvements were small, but they were mine. I could lift my right hand an inch higher. I could hold a cup with my left hand steadier than before. I could speak full sentences more clearly. And each night, when I lay alone in my bed, I whispered 2 words to myself, the same 2 words that carried me through the darkest nights. Keep going. Not for my children. Not for the visitors who never came. Not to prove anything. But because giving up would hurt me more than their absence ever could. One morning, as I was practicing my speech exercises, a nurse walked in with a small stack of mail. "For you," she said. The words stunned me. Mail? For me? My hands trembled, not from weakness but from disbelief. I stared at the envelopes. Not from my children. Not from family. But from volunteers. From church groups who wrote to patients. From strangers who sent cheerful cards that said things like "You are stronger than you know" or "Thinking of you today." One letter was handwritten. A woman named Margaret, in her 70s, recovering from surgery. She wrote, "I don't know you, but I know loneliness. If it comforts you at all, please remember someone out here is rooting for you." I read that line 5 times. 6, 7. It felt like someone had placed a warm hand on my back. I wrote back the next day, my handwriting shaky, my words slow but honest. "I don't know you either, Margaret. But thank you for reminding me that strangers can offer the kindness family sometimes forgets." Over the next week, the young college volunteer visited again. He read to me from a book of memoirs. Stories of ordinary people who survived extraordinary things. After finishing one chapter, he asked, "Do you ever think about writing your own story?" I smiled crookedly, a smile the stroke left me, and said, "I don't know if anyone would want to read it." He shook his head. "No, people need stories like yours. Stories that remind them life doesn't end just because something breaks." His words lingered in the air long after he left. That night, the lamp cast its usual circle of gold on the floor. But this time it felt different. Brighter. Warmer. Like the beginning of something instead of the ending. I reached for my notebook, the one the social worker had given me, in case you want to write things down, and I opened it for the first time. The first page was blank, staring back at me with a silent invitation. My right hand couldn't move well enough to write, so I used my left. Slow, uneven strokes. But I wrote anyway. The first sentence was simple. I am learning to live with what I've lost. The second sentence came easier. And even more. I am learning to live with what I still have. As I wrote, I realized something that felt both painful and freeing. My story was no longer about who didn't show up. It was about who did. Nurses. Strangers. A young volunteer. A woman named Margaret. The therapist who believed in my steps. The world that kept offering me small pieces of hope when I least expected them. It wasn't the family I dreamed of. But it was still love. Just in a different form. As the days turned into another week, I found myself looking at the visitor's chair with new eyes. It no longer represented the ache of abandonment. It represented possibility. It represented the space where new people, unexpected people, could sit. And maybe most importantly, it represented the place where I could sit too, as a man who learned how to survive the kind of heartbreak that doesn't show up on medical scans. One evening, while sitting by the window watching the sky turn a soft shade of lavender, I whispered to myself, "They broke my heart, but they didn't break me." And then, after a long, trembling breath, "And they won't." The day they told me I was strong enough to go home, I didn't feel excitement. I didn't feel relief. What I felt was something gentler. Something quieter. A soft, steady acceptance I'd earned step by painful step. The social worker asked me if someone would be picking me up. I told her no. I said it without shame this time. Without that sting in my chest. Without trying to hide it behind excuses. She nodded kindly. Arranged transportation. Made sure my medication was packed neatly in a small brown bag. Placed my notebook inside my duffel so it wouldn't bend. When the transport van pulled into the circular driveway, I sat there for a moment, one last moment, staring at the rehab entrance. Weeks ago, I had been wheeled in half broken, half silent, and fully abandoned. Now I was leaving slower, weaker, but somehow, stronger. Not in body. Not completely. But in the quiet places of the heart where real strength hides. The driver helped me into the van, fastened my seatbelt, and asked gently, "Ready?" I nodded. But the truth was, I wasn't ready. Not for home. Not for the silence that waited there. Not for the empty rooms that once held laughter and footsteps and birthday candles. But healing rarely waits for readiness. It moves when it must. The drive home was slow, passing familiar streets that felt strangely distant, as if they belonged to someone I used to be. When we reached my house, the world looked the same, but I didn't. My driveway. My porch. My door. Everything exactly where I left it. And yet, everything felt touched by time, by memory, by loss. The driver carried my bag to the door, and I stood there gripping my cane, feeling the uneven pulse beneath my fingers. He offered to walk me inside. I shook my head. "I can do it," I said softly. And for the first time, I truly believed it. Stepping over that threshold felt like entering a museum of my former life. Photographs still hung on the walls. My children when they were small, my wife in her favorite summer dress, holidays we spent together before time and distance rewrote our connections. I touched the frame of one picture, the four of us at a beach years ago. The sun bright, our smiles brighter. My throat tightened. But I didn't crumble. Instead I whispered, "It's okay. I forgive you. I forgive all of us." Because forgiveness, I had learned, isn't about excusing what hurt us. It's about releasing the part of ourselves that keeps reopening the wound. I settled into my living room chair, the one that molded itself to my body over decades. My right hand rested quietly in my lap, still weak, still slow, but no longer a stranger. Across from me stood another chair. The same kind as the one in my rehab room. My visitor's chair. But this time it didn't feel empty. It felt open. Ready for whoever would come next, even if it wasn't the people I once waited for. The first evening back home, I opened my notebook again. The house was silent, but not cruelly so. More like a silence that was waiting for something new to be written inside it. I wrote slowly, carefully. I am still becoming. Even now. Even here. The next day, a knock came at my door, soft, hesitant. I assumed it was a delivery or maybe a neighbor who noticed I was back. But when I opened the door, the young college volunteer stood there, a little out of breath, holding a grocery bag in his hands. "I wanted to check on you," he said. "No one should come home alone after everything you've been through." I stood there for a moment, feeling something warm gather behind my ribs, not the sharp ache of abandonment, but the gentle pulse of gratitude. I stepped aside. "Come in," I said. He did. And just like that, my house wasn't empty anymore. He unpacked the groceries onto my counter. Basic things: soup, bread, fruit, cereal. We talked for a while. Not much. Just enough. Before he left, he looked at the visitor's chair and said, smiling, "I'll sit there next time." Next time. It was such a small phrase, but it softened a part of me I didn't realize was still tense. After he left, I walked, slowly, back to my chair. The setting sun poured through the window, painting the room in amber light. Half my body remained stubborn and hesitant, but both sides of my heart felt steady, alive, whole in a new way. And in that golden quiet, I understood something I had been circling for weeks. You can survive a stroke. You can survive being forgotten. You can survive the heartbreak of watching your family drift away. But the hardest thing to survive is believing you no longer matter. And once you stop believing that, once you choose even in the smallest way to keep living, to keep reaching, to keep opening your door to the world, you begin to heal in places you didn't know were broken. As the last light faded, I whispered into the stillness, "I matter. So, even now. Especially now." And for the first time in a very long time, I believed my own voice. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need the reminder. Even at our age, our stories still matter. And so do we.